Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. My name is Brian Roach. With me are the inquirers, Mike Heron, KC, Pania Gray. I thought Mr. Heron and Pania would make some opening remarks and then I'll say a few words. After that, I'm really happy to take questions. But before I hand over to Pania and Mike for context, I want to say something about the scope of the inquiry. The Commission's jurisdiction and my jurisdiction covers the public service and public servants. The inquiry did not independently assess the conduct or make findings against third parties. Legislation limits the Commission's scope to public service agencies. The inquirers heard serious allegations that go to the integrity of our democratic process. Those matters, because they were outside the scope of our inquiry, have been referred to the appropriate authorities, namely the Police and Privacy Commissioner, who have the legislated, regulatory and investigative tools to consider them. I'll now ask Pania and Mike to say a few words.
Kia ora. Before Mike and I summarise the key findings and conclusions, I will recap the background to the inquiry quickly. The inquiry concerns allegations reported in the media in June 2024 that personal information provided either by or to government agencies for COVID-19 vaccination purposes or the 2023 census were used for improper purposes by certain service providers. The agencies that we were asked to inquire into were Te Pou Matakana, the Ministry of Health, Te Whatuora Health New Zealand, Statistics New Zealand, the Ministry of Social Development and Oranga Tamariki. The three providers were Te Pou Matakana, also known as the Whānau Water Commissioning Agency or WACA, Manurewa Marae Trust Board and the Whānau Waipareira Trust. Our task was to establish the facts and make an independent assessment of government agencies' activities in relation to the allegations within our scope. There were two ways that personal information was shared for COVID-19 vaccination purposes: controlled access to the national immunisation databases and formal data sharing agreements. We were satisfied that the safeguards and institutional arrangements in place for the service providers' staff accessing the COVID-19 immunisation registers were both adequate and effective. There was extensive training, multi-factor authentication and regular surveillance for unusual activity operating. Personal information on those databases cannot be downloaded or transferred. The Ministry of Health and then Te Whatuora entered into a number of data sharing agreements or DSAs with Te Pou Matakana. In short, we were satisfied that the terms of those DSAs laid strong foundations for the protection of personal health information shared for COVID-19 vaccination purposes. While the front-end safeguards were adequate and appropriate, the back-end safeguards were lacking. There was limited checking that those foundation safeguards were being met, and we found that there was a lack of controls once the data was downloaded by providers. Further, neither the Ministry of Health nor Te Whatuora have a facility to audit the providers' use of the data. This meant that the parties relied on trust that the DSA terms were being complied with. We do not consider this to be appropriate. Te Whatuora told us that it intends to fix these shortcomings in its standard DSA terms. At the time we carried out our inquiries, Te Whatuora had not yet obtained satisfactory assurance that Te Pou Matakana and Waipareira had complied with all of the obligations that sat across the data sharing arrangements. We record that this is unsatisfactory as it meant that we could not conclude on how effective the safeguards and institutional arrangements have been. We note that Te Whatuora stopped sharing data with Te Pou Matakana in June 2024. We also note in our report that Te Whatuora was satisfied that Manurewa Marae had complied with its obligations. We found that there were no safeguards in place for either the Ministry or Te Whatuora to identify or manage possible conflicts of interest in relation to these data sharing arrangements. Both agencies have accepted our findings and Te Whatuora has, as the lead agency for health data sharing, advised us that it will revise the DSA terms to provide for the active consideration of conflicts of interest. Our inquiry found that there was no evidence that either the Ministry or Te Whatuora were made aware of the allegations within our scope prior to the June 2024 media reporting. hand over to Mike.
Thanks, Pania. In relation to stats and the census 2023, stats shared data for non-responding households with Te Pou Matakana. The information was shared under an information sharing agreement. Concerns about the management of personal information were raised with stats, both internally and externally, including while the contract was being performed. The complaints raised by stats employees were largely ignored. Stats dealt with the external concerns as best it could. The safeguards and institutional arrangements we found in relation to protection of personal information were insufficient for several reasons. The first is that stats provided information to Te Pou Matakana before it understood how it would be dealt with, handled, protected and destroyed. Stats removed the requirement for certificates of confidentiality, which is a key requirement to ensure the protection of census data. Stats did not finalise a privacy assessment, a privacy impact assessment that is, and drafts we've seen show confusion about the management of information. Stats did not provide adequate training, and the training materials that Te Pou Matakana provided raised red flags as to how information was to be protected and or used. The conflict of interest terms in the contract only considered conflicts arising from Te Pou Matakana. It didn't expressly provide for conflicts arising from subcontractors such as Manurewa Marae. That risk was raised early in the process by a stats employee. But in any event, neither party to the contract seems to have considered the conflicts of interest provisions, and possible conflicting interests were not identified or managed. We find the aim of the stats contract with Te Pou Matakana was well-intentioned, and the resulting additional census forms meant that stats considered the contract was successful. However, the stats processes meant there was a risk of the mishandling of personal information which was not addressed, and as a result there was a risk of the collection or use of personal information for an improper purpose. In respect of Te Puni Kokiri, Ministry for Social Development and Oranga Tamariki, none of these agencies were providing personal information within the scope of the inquiry. Neither Te Puni Kokiri nor Oranga Tamariki management were aware of the allegations, and there's insufficient evidence for us to conclude whether MSD management were notified of these allegations before they became public. Just finally from me, two observations we make in the report, that the protections for personal information existing in agreements or contracts are just only one part of the overall protections required. The ability to monitor, audit and hold accountable relevant contractual parties is also important. And following from that, when concerns were surfaced publicly by the media about the relevant service providers using personal information for improper purposes, those providers all swiftly refuted the allegations. However, we find that none of the agencies were able to draw on their existing assurance systems to respond to the allegations, and that we say is problematic. Back to you, Pania. Thanks.
The inquiry terms enable us to make referrals to other agencies, and we've made a number of referrals to the Privacy Commissioner for his consideration. The first relates to a lack of systematic means for agencies to assure themselves that the relevant service providers were meeting all relevant privacy protections. The second related to the absence of underlying systems and controls for the storage, use and disposal of data after transmission through secure systems from the agencies to the relevant service providers. Third, alleged unauthorised use of personal information collected for COVID-19 vaccination purposes or at the point of COVID-19 vaccination. And finally, how privacy obligations were met by the providers during the collection of census data. Our terms of reference required us to establish the facts and to form a view on government agencies' activity, not to reach a conclusion about whether providers used personal information for an improper purpose. We note that some of these matters are subject to the police investigation. There were also 2 employment-related matters which came to our attention during the inquiry, and as they were out of scope, we referred these back to the agencies concerned. Right.
Thank you, Mike and Pania. The public service has a duty to protect the personal information of New Zealanders. That is a non-negotiable value. This inquiry has found some agencies failed in their responsibility to protect and manage the sharing of personal information. While we don't know if personal information was improperly used, the opportunity was left open, which is unacceptable. As I've said, it will be for other authorities with the appropriate regulatory and investigative tools to determine whether personal data was misused. Regardless of what those authorities find, New Zealanders rightfully expect government agencies will protect and manage their personal information, and that didn't happen, which is unacceptable. In my view, the report makes for very sobering reading. It raises a number of issues that go to the core of the confidence and trust required to maintain the integrity and sanctity of information entrusted to government agencies. The system has failed, and that isn't acceptable, and it must be and will be remedied. As we enter a rapidly changing world where data and information is a key asset, we need stronger processes around the use of information. That work is underway with a view to it being applied across the public sector. Stats New Zealand failed to address a significant risk of mishandling of personal information it collected for the purposes of the census, even when concerns were raised internally. This was unacceptable. Given the findings of the report and recognising the need for accountability, the Chief Executive of Stats New Zealand has advised me he will not be seeking reappointment. I think it's the right thing to do in the circumstances, and I respect Mr Sowden for what would have been a tough decision. Mark's decision to step down reflects positively on his professionalism and his integrity, which is in line with the standards of accountability I expect of public service chief executives. The inquiry also found the Ministry of Health and Health New Zealand Te Whataora had insufficient safeguards for managing conflicts of interest arising from the sharing of personal health information with the relevant service providers. While this is less serious, it fell short of our own standards and expectations. There are lessons here for the public service which we need to get right for the future. Clearly, we need to raise the bar. As the result of the findings of this inquiry, I have taken a number of actions to help restore public trust and confidence. I have asked agencies with inquiry findings against them to immediately suspend on a temporary basis the renewal, extending or entering into new contracts with third-party providers named in the report until those agencies can satisfy me that their contracts are fit for purpose and adequately deal with the information sharing and conflict of interest obligations. It is my intention that by 1 July, all new information sharing agreements between the public service and any third parties must comply with the new information sharing standards. Secondly, we are updating guidance and templates for information sharing arrangements. We are strengthening public service procurement practices to reflect the new standards. We have reviewed and updated the Commission's conflict of interest model standards. This means all third-party providers who enter into agreement with core public service agencies will also need to meet the obligations around conflict of interest and sharing of personal information. This will strengthen accountability settings for all public service agencies when contracting and information sharing with third-party service providers. I have also asked the Ministry of Justice to consider whether changes are needed to electoral law regarding financial incentives to switch electoral rolls. In addition, and as Pania noted earlier, the inquiry leads have made a referral to the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. The police are looking at other matters.